Hi, welcome to this Q&A on the elections. I'm sorry we're late. We were changing a lens. The camera is still trying to set up this home studio. We will begin or resurrect the Chris Hedges report on Wednesday, where I interview the Palestinian novelist Atif Abu Saif, who was in Gaza on October 7th, was trapped there and for 85 days and wrote this book, which is really quite moving. Don't Look Left. And it will be an interview about around his book. So we are in our election season. I have not supported the Democratic Party now for over 2 decades. I worked, of course, for Ralph Nader. I was a speechwriter. Ralph's presidential campaign was not designed to win, but to remove 5, 10, 15 million people from the Democratic Party to create pressure on the Democratic Party. Ralph consciously made this move after the corporate lobbyists essentially pushed the liberal wing of the Democratic Party out of office. This was primarily under Clinton. Ralph authored, I think, 24 pieces of legislation, but those were passed. The Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA, all this came from Ralph Nader, but it was passed by Fulbright and other liberals within the Democratic Party. And once those liberals were eradicated from the party, Ralph, in a kind of Hail Mary, decided to mount an independent presidential campaign as a way to put pressure on the Democrats. What they did, of course, was turn him into a pariah. So that is the big question, especially for those of us who are concerned over the genocide in Gaza. How are we going to respond in this particular election cycle? And one has to acknowledge that Trump is a very frightening figure and will certainly be far more vindictive and far more dangerous should he be reelected than he was in his first term in office. So we already have questions, and I'll begin with some of those. Well, the first question is, the Democrats have long touted their commitment to democracy as the reason to vote for them over the allegedly anti-democratic Republicans. What does the Democrats' anointing of Harris without any open convention or discussion of her policy platform, and with her having earned 0 delegates in the primary process, say about the Democrats' supposed commitment to democracy in comparison to the Republicans? Well, this is, of course, the irony, because however fascistic Trump supporters are, it's a genuine base. In fact, they have supplanted the establishment Republican Party, which is just fused now with the establishment Democratic Party, people like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, the Bushes, and others. But the Democratic Party itself does not function as a political party, and the anointing of Harris is the most egregious example of that, as this questioner points out, for all the reasons that he or she points out. But that's always been true. So where did Biden come from as a presidential candidate? He was the foil for Bernie Sanders in the 2020 elections. He fared very poorly in the primaries, and then there was pressure on the other candidates to drop out. Biden has worked for or held federal office for 47 years. He has always served the interests of corporate America, the billionaire class, the defense industry. His nickname was Senator Credit Card. Many credit card companies are based in Delaware, his home state. He was selected by Obama largely because his voting record was Republican, and he was a Republican in all but name. He was calling for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded Iraq. He was instrumental in the Patriot Act and NAFTA, the great betrayal of the working class, 30 million Americans suffering mass layoffs since 1996. That's when record keeping began. He formulated these 3 strikes you're outlaws, where people can go to prison without parole for nonviolent offenses, militarizing police, doubling our prison population, ripping down the firewalls between investment and commercial banks under Glass-Steagall, which helped precipitate the global financial meltdown, on and on and on. And in the early career, opposed busing, opposed abortion. So he was selected to be president, and then in the primary, he was again essentially anointed. There were no debates. There were no serious candidates allowed to run against him. And then the billionaire class pulled the plug. That's what happened. Then you see these headlines about Kamala Harris raising $200 million, but it was the billionaire class and reading the internal polling that the Democratic Party had that suggested that should he continue in the race, it would be a rout. They would not only lose the presidency, but lose control of the Congress. And so they withheld the money. That's what speaks. And he was forced to drop out of the race. And then we get another anointed candidate, Kamala Harris. And the Democratic voters are little more than stage props, which has always been true. But I think now it's even more transparent than it was in the past. So yeah, it's not a functioning democratic system. It has the facade, the iconography, the language, and the rhetoric of democracy, but we don't live in a democracy. And this has been, I think, explained probably better, or the person who explained it better than anyone is Sheldon Wolin in his book, Democracy Incorporated. Sheldon Wolin being our most important, he died a couple of years ago, our most important contemporary political philosopher, taught at Berkeley, taught at Princeton, was Cornel West's intellectual mentor. And if you go on YouTube, I did the last interview with him 11 months before he died. It's a 3-hour interview. But yeah, it's like the late Roman Republic, where the institutions remain, but internally, of course, the corporatists and the billionaire class have seized all of the levers of power. This is from Bill Astor. Are we as Americans dealing with the real banality of evil in this election? Evidence suggests that Hannah Arendt didn't quite get it right when she examined Adolf Eichmann, that he was less banal than she thought, that he was brighter, more energetic, and more committed to the Nazi cause, including the Holocaust, than he let on during his trial. But I really wonder about figures like Biden, Harris, and Trump, especially their words on the genocide in Gaza. This seemed truly banal in a way that perhaps Eichmann wasn't. Perhaps it's difficult to attack evil in American politics because it is so banal, at least in those presented to us as our leaders. Well, that's a good question. It raises a few issues, but let's start with the Eichmann trial. And I think, Bill, you're right that, and I admire Hannah Arendt very much, but I think she got it wrong because, of course, Eichmann had no power when he was sitting in the dock in Israel being tried for his role in the genocide. And these are banal figures out of power, mediocrities out of power, pathetic figures even out of power. But in power, of course, they are evil and they are quite dangerous. And not surprisingly, during his trial in Jerusalem, he attempted to distance himself from the Holocaust, although, of course, he was instrumental in overseeing the murder of some 6 million Jews and about 5 million other communists and gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses and gay men and women, etc., political opponents and everything else, and Russians, a lot of Russian POWs. So, yeah, I think that's right. But I think that an Eichmann is different from a Trump, a Harris, or a Biden. These figures are essentially the face, the acceptable face of empire. In particular, Biden, Obama, Harris. And what's interesting is watching the reaction of the ruling class towards Trump and towards figures like Biden or Obama. So when Bernie Sanders, and without corporate money, of course, Bernie Sanders would have been the Democratic nominee in 2020. And I think Bernie Sanders, because he actually offered a real alternative in a way that the establishment Democrats are not, I suspect he could have beaten Trump. So what we saw in 2020 was the rise of a political figure like Biden, who was able to mollify the voters enough on behalf of his corporate masters to serve the system that he has always served. But these people are not the architects of the system in a way that Eichmann was instrumental in organizing the transports and the industrial killing that defined the Holocaust. They're the public face of the system, the smiley face of the system. That's what an Obama was. That's what a Biden is. Trump is a little different in this sense, that the ruling class is uncomfortable with Trump because he's so impulsive. He's so intellectually shallow. He's consumed by narcissism. Of course, it's all about him. Not that I think Biden is a particularly pleasant figure, at least privately, from all I can gather. And so his volatility is something that worries the ruling class. But remember that when the major donors of the Democratic Party, like Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, faced the prospect of Bernie Sanders being the nominee, they announced that they would support Trump. Bernie Sanders is hardly a political revolutionary. He's kind of a Kennedy-style Democrat. I'm thinking of Robert Kennedy-style Democrat. But that was too much for the ruling class. And it's clear that they would have done, if Sanders had gotten the nomination, which was never going to happen, they would have done to Sanders what the ruling class did in 1972 to George McGovern, the last candidate who seriously confronted the military-industrial complex, McGovern himself being a highly decorated pilot in World War II. And you saw a fusion of the hierarchy of the Democratic Party with the hierarchy of the Republican Party to destroy George McGovern's candidacy. And that's what they would have done to Sanders, because their economic interests are paramount, and they're willing to support Trump to make sure their economic interests, this kind of system which is seized up, where money is funneled upwards and the vulnerable are increasingly exploited by predatory corporations, is untouched. And they know that, of course, Biden, Trump, all of these figures will not significantly interfere with the distortions that their lobbyists and their money has created. But I wouldn't look at a Biden or a Harris as kind of intrinsically evil, the way, of course, an Eichmann is. This is from Stuart Malcolm. How do I have conversations with my liberal friends and family members who seem to be blinded by the Trump derangement syndrome? Is there anything you can recommend that has helped you to push the ball further other than giving up? Well, this, of course, is the problem with operating in the world of slogans, cliches, sound bites, and eschewing a kind of investigation into the actual systems of power and how they work. And if you don't examine the systems of power, Sheldon Wolin, I mention again, but if you don't understand how capitalism works, if you haven't read David Harvey and these kinds of great figures that lay bare the machinery of the system, then you're kind of captive to the system. So I teach in a prison, and one of the books I have my students read is called Society of Captives. It's by a Princeton sociologist who went into the Trenton prisons in the 1950s, I think. His name is Sykes, and explained how the power structure of a prison works. And it's an important book because once you explain, and much of the administration of a prison depends on co-opting prisoners to essentially be part of the mechanism of their own imprisonment. And that, of course, as Antonio Gramsci and others pointed out, is exactly what the ruling elites do to us. But if you live within the surface environment of propaganda, of the mainstream media, which amplifies these propaganda points, of the quick and empty cliches that are used to define the candidates and define the system, then you're already imprisoned. It requires turning off your devices and reading. And it's all there. We don't live in a society where these books are censored. It's kind of like Huxley. We live in a society where we're mesmerized by electronic hallucinations and we don't investigate the reality around us. So all of that is a kind of long-winded answer, but it is a way of saying that if people are not willing to carry out that rigorous intellectual investigation, then they're already trapped by the system. And once you have to speak, Chomsky writes about this, but once you're forced to communicate in the very limited cliches they use to describe reality, you can't begin to explain what's actually happening around because those cliches and those slogans don't give you the vocabulary to explain reality. You have to step outside of the cliches, and that's why sound bites are so pernicious. So, if you're interviewed on CNN and you get, if you're lucky to get a minute or 2 minutes, as soon as you step out the parameters of those easily digestible cliches, you might as well be speaking hieroglyphics. And that's why figures like Chomsky is another one. Noam Chomsky is extremely important in terms of dissecting the nature of power, propaganda, and how it works. But that really requires an investment in books, in reading. You're not going to get it, there may be interesting things on YouTube, but you're not going to get it till you sit down and you have to read Marx. It's not an easy read. I've honestly only finished the first volume of Capital, but it's important. Marx's critique of, I'm not a Marxist, but Marx's critique of how capitalism works is correct. And Engels' book, the 1845 book on the conditions of the English working class, is also really, really good. So, there are no shortage of great intellectuals who have explained to us what's happening around us, but we have to read them. And if we don't read them, we've essentially crippled ourselves in terms of being able to respond. And that's one of the things that Richard Wolff and Cornel West and I did. We had a series of talks based around important theorists in the hopes that people would go out and read those theorists. So that was Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Marx, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Paine, the great radical and the revolutionary, wrote Common Sense. But in a way, you've got to invest time in these great political theorists who have laid bare how these systems work. You can't fight these systems if you don't understand them. Is Project 2025 actually the despotic and novel authoritarian plan that liberals have been claiming it is? Or is it more of a typical bipartisan national security state agenda supporting endless wars and mass surveillance being spun as a boogeyman? Well, I haven't read the whole thing, to be honest. There was a New York Times reporter who did read the whole thing and did a pretty good job of pulling out the salient points within it. It's not a Trump plan. It's a Heritage Foundation plan. But I think it is dangerous. And it is frightening because what it does, and I mean, even to the point where they have suggested cabinet appointments and department heads and everything else, Trump went into the White House the last time really without any agenda or any plan at all. And what you have now are the most retrograde political forces essentially creating a structure, a plan, a vision that Trump can adopt. And it's clear that the hands of the Christian right, and my book, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War in America, which I spent 2 years on, will kind of lay out the danger of this movement, which preceded Trump and which fills Trump's kind of ideological void. They have a deep hand in it. So I think it's important in terms of laying out, if Trump is elected, where his presidency will go, and the kind of vigorous effort on the part of a Trump administration to snuff out the last vestiges of our democracy. Trump will turn, of course, on the Democratic Party establishment, on the media, on the Democratic Party leadership. People like me will come later. And he will attempt to deform the federal bureaucracy, and it's what all cult leaders do, into kind of a system that is defined by personal loyalty to him. So yeah, I think it is chilling, and I think it at least the sections that I've read of it's quite a massive document, and I probably should sit down and read the whole thing, but I think it is kind of frightening in terms of the vision that they have, and the fact that if Trump is elected, they will begin on day one to implement this vision. This is from Metal Mykov. Do you think there is any merit to Trump and Vance's purported defense of the American working class? No. These people are con artists, and they are no friend of the American working class at all. So, no, I don't. I think that there are figures who have bought into these criticisms of the deep state or criticisms of the working class. But we know from 4 years of Trump, where their interests lie. Trump responds to the highest bidder, and the working class can't compete. This is from Laura Kaminsky. What, in general, do you think Marx got wrong? I think Marx's vision of the classless society and the withering away of the state, and the kind of deification of the proletariat, I think those were all wrong. I take a much darker view of human nature than Marx. I think in that sense, Marx's vision was utopian and not achievable, because it was utopian. But as I said earlier, I think that his analysis of the system of capitalism was brilliant. I mean, Marx had all sorts of pet theories that, of course, that the revolution, or the classless society would rise out of the most advanced state of industrialization. That was proven wrong with, of course, the Russian Revolution. So it's Marx's utopianism that I don't embrace. And I think that and I will go to Julian Benda's The Treason of the Intellectuals, that those of us who are intellectuals or writers or dissidents or artists or whatever have to always be in opposition to power, no matter. In that sense, I share Chomsky's kind of embrace of anarchism, at least as an intellectual. And Benda, in The Treason of the Intellectuals, where he writes about intellectuals who sell out to power, especially in universities, he says that you can serve either justice and truth or privilege and power. But the more concessions you make to privilege and power, the more you diminish your capacity to fight for justice and truth. And I think that's right. And that's something that Marx never saw. What is your take on RFK Jr. running as an independent? Well, Dennis Kucinich originally was his campaign manager, and Dennis is a friend of mine. And early, I think even before RFK announced, Dennis reached out to me about potentially working with RFK, and I asked Dennis, what's his position on Israel? I spent 7 years in the Middle East, and much of that time in Gaza and among the Palestinians, and that is just a fundamental issue for me. And Dennis never responded because, of course, RFK's position on Israel is appalling. It's not even mainstream. He embraces the worst, kind of vision of the Zionist settler movement. I mean, he's kind of all over the place, and I wish he had a more coherent political agenda. I mean, obviously, there are things that he says that are correct and that are important, including about the power of the CIA and the intelligence community and militarism and everything else. But because of my deep investment, both as a reporter and an emotional investment in the Palestinians, I can't support a candidate. It's one of the reasons I won't support Harris or the Democratic Party, because of the complicity with genocide. When he's a full-throated supporter of this genocide, which it's the crime. Genocide is the crime of crimes. It's a moral issue in the end. It's not a political issue, and he's on the wrong side of that issue. So this is Zavash Bakhtiar. What are the chances we go to war in Iran in a Harris administration versus a Trump administration? So the U.S. military, of course, Netanyahu and Israel has been pushing for a war in Iran for a long time. They want us to do to Iran what they got us to do to Iraq. The neocons and the Zionists, their interests converged in this disastrous fiasco in Iraq. But the Pentagon has been adamant, and the intelligence community has been adamant in opposing any confrontation with Iran. That is not going to change under Trump or Harris. So they're going to have to fight very hard against entrenched institutional power to prevent a war with Iran. Nobody wants it. Iran doesn't want it. There may be a proxy war with Hezbollah that may be coming up sooner than we think. But Iran doesn't want it, and the U.S. doesn't want it. Iran is not Lebanon. It's a very different country, and Iran has the ability to significantly hurt, especially Israel, but also us in terms of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz and everything else. So, yeah, I could be wrong, but going by past history, there's been deep opposition within the American military establishment and within the American intelligence community to going to war with Iran. This is from The Boss. To what extent is Kamala Harris complicit in Palestinian genocide? How does swapping Biden for Harris affect your red line against voting for genocide? Well, when they stop sending the weapons, then I might consider voting for Harris. That ain't going to happen. Rhetorically, I mean, and Biden, Biden's rhetoric changed too significantly. But it's our job to punish the Democrats for genocide. That's our job. And I take this from Middle East Eye, which is a very good publication, along with Electronic Intifada, and I found it really interesting. This is an analysis of the recent elections in the UK, and I was in Blackburn to help campaign for my friend Craig Murray, who did extremely well. They pitched another anti-genocide candidate. This is the way it appears that Labour countered independent candidates who ran primarily on the issue of Gaza, is they would put in another anti-genocide candidate, which they did. But Labour was shellacked. 5 independent in Blackburn, although Jeremy didn't win. The independent candidate won by, I think, 158 votes or something. Craig didn't win. So, but 5 independent candidates did win. And I found this analysis by Middle East Eye extremely revealing, and I think instructive for the rest of us. So, of course, Starmer was wiped out, or Keir Starmer won and wiped out the Tory leadership, but their majority rests on a lower popular vote. That's 9.7 million. Then Jeremy Corbyn won in the so-called catastrophe general election of 2019. He got 10.2 million votes, and it's 3 million votes less than Corbyn won in 2017 general election. He got 12.8 million. Starmer himself won fewer votes in his own constituency under his own leadership than he did in both elections when Corbyn was the Labour leader. What happened was the Muslim voters either voted for independence or stayed home, and along with a lot of other people who are appalled at the UK's complicity in this genocide. The voter turnout slumped to the second lowest since universal suffrage was granted in 1928. The Green Party won 4 seats. Previously, I think it had held 1. The Corbyn was returned as an independent in Islington North, with his majority barely changed, although there was a concerted effort on the part of Labour to unseat him. Unfortunately, George Galloway, my friend George Galloway, the Workers' Party, lost in the Rochdale. He'd been elected in the Rochdale by-election in February. So those who stood on a anti-genocide platform managed to inflict a lot of damage to Labour. And of course, we just saw the French elections and the new Popular Front in France, left wing, shellacking Macron. What we've seen is what I found very interesting is the response on the part of the new Starmer government. So they have restored funding to UNRWA, which they had cut under this bogus charge by Israel that UNRWA workers, this United Nations Works Agency, which provides most of the relief to Palestinians, both in Gaza, the West Bank, and in the diaspora. They've restored funding to UNRWA, and there are reports in the British press that the British Foreign Secretary under Starmer, who was awful, is awful, and was instrumental in blacklisting Corbyn as an anti-Semite and driving him out of the Labour Party. They're talking about considering arms restrictions and maybe even an arms embargo against Israel. Well, that is because they realize that their foundations are weak. If we don't make the Democratic Party pay for this, then not only have we essentially announced that we stand for nothing, and that there is no red line, that we are willing to essentially be complicit in genocide, but that it can also happen again. And I don't want Trump. Trump frightens me for all the reasons I said before. But I didn't embrace this genocide. I'm not complicit in carrying out this genocide. And I can. Of course, I have Palestinian friends. I can't. I just was in Ramallah visiting Atif Abu Saif, who I'll interview, who will be my first interview. It was very moving. I mean, I honestly had a hard time kind of holding it together during the interview. I can't, given the suffering that they have endured, do anything, however marginal in terms of voting, to be complicit in this genocide. But the most important thing is that if we walk out the way that many voters in the UK walked out, it's going to have an effect. This is from The Game. Are these politicians and elites actually evil, or are they ignorant of what they're doing? Is it binary like that, or am I missing another possibility? Gaza is so horrible. Yeah, I mean, I would describe most of the elites as amoral. They don't have any moral center at all, sort of like Christopher Hitchens, who had a debate over the new atheists. There just is no moral core at all. They're in that sense, they facilitate evil. I don't think that's quite the same as being evil in the way that Eichmann is evil. Is Project 2025 actually novel in its ambitions for domestic and foreign policy, or is it typical of DC conservatism? No, it's novel in that it essentially embraces a Christian totalitarian state. It creates mechanisms or programs by which institutions that were once democratic, i.e., they serve the interests of the electorate rather than the elites, are destroyed, including, of course, social services. They desperately want to turn all the money in Social Security over to their friends on Wall Street. So, yeah, I think it is. It has a radicalness to it. This is Eduardo Colella. Do you see any significant changes in U.S. foreign policy with recent events in Venezuela. Well, I mean, all the efforts to essentially overthrow the Venezuelan government collapsed in disaster. I'm sure the CIA is busy trying to create whatever chaos, economic and political chaos that it can create. But our very overt effort to overthrow the Venezuelan government already failed, pretty spectacularly. This is from Jay Shao. Why are so many progressives and leftists going for Kamala? I mean, because I suppose Trump, they're a fear of Trump because they're swayed by the bombardment of propaganda that holds her up as, some kind of, a lot of it's woke politics because she's a woman of color. Although, we should have gotten over that with Obama, as Cornel West said, was just a black mascot for Wall Street. I don't know. I mean, it's a mystery to me because there's nothing she's done as in California or anywhere else that, she was a cop, basically. She was and served the interests of law enforcement when she was Attorney General in California. There's nothing in the record. I mean, when Obama ran, when he announced he was running, he'd only spent 2 years in the Senate. Dennis Kucinich printed out and gave me a copy of Obama's voting record. And he said, you got to read this because it's every corporate giveaway that's possible he supported. And Dennis said, this is I'm imitating Dennis. He said, this is what he said, that when he went to go to baseball games in Cleveland, the ushers would go up and down and he would say, get the scorecard. He said, that's the scorecard. This is the scorecard. This is all that matters. All the, hundreds of millions of dollars they invest in propaganda is essentially an effort to divert you from looking at the scorecard. And her scorecard's abysmal. And that's, of course, why she's been anointed to run and why the billionaire class, what'd she make? Raised $200 million this week or something. That's why they pulled the plug on Biden, because they knew he was going down, or he was going to bring everybody down with him. And they have given her all this money. It's also the whole idea that money, I mean, when we watch the media, it's how much money did they get? How much money did they raise? That becomes the rubric by which a candidate is deemed serious or not serious. This is John, MC55, as an old school socialist who has lived in the U.S. for 35 years. I find that I cannot vote for any of the candidates from the two major parties for the last 20 years. Who is left for me to vote for? Well, number one, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it would be illegal. I mean, I assume that Jill Stein will be on the New Jersey ballot. I voted Green or Cornel West. I would vote for one of those candidates. I certainly will not vote. I mean, some states have a write-in option. So there are alternatives, although, as Teresa Armato, who was Ralph Nader's campaign manager, in her book, and she herself is quite a brilliant lawyer, as is Ralph, she details the way the two parties have collaborated to essentially prohibit ballot access, to make ballot access very, very difficult for any independent or third-party candidate. And that's their decision. And they lock them out of the debates. They make it extremely hard for them to run. Because the advertising revenue is so onerous, they can't manage to get themselves significant airtime. I remember Ralph, he held a rally in Madison Square Garden. He didn't have the money to rent Madison Square Garden, but he just hoped that enough people would pay $5 at the door, which they did, and he filled it. I think he had about 10,000 people in Madison Square Garden, but he couldn't reach the millions of people that he could if he could be on the debate platform. And believe me, I would not want to have to debate Ralph Nader. Nor could he reach the millions of people through political advertising. So the way the system is built is essentially shut out third-party candidates. And one of my problems with Bernie Sanders is that when he ran, he talked about a political revolution. As soon as Hillary Clinton was the nominee, that political revolution became about supporting Clinton. You're not going to build a political revolution in an election cycle. Syriza, it took them 10 years, and they were polling originally at around 4% to take power in Greece. I mean, that the other issue of what Syriza did once it took power, but it took them 10 years to get into power. And it takes a long, long time to build an alternative. But I don't think the Democratic Party is reformable. And I think that we have to step outside the system and begin to put pressure on it, if only for the climate crisis alone. And my good friend Roger Hallam, who founded Extinction Rebellion and runs the group Just Stop Oil, just got a 5-year prison sentence for nonviolent civil disobedience. So when you actually challenge the system in a real way, the way Roger did, they're very, very unforgiving. This is from Patricia O'Brien. But Chris, there are many outstanding Christians who are also straddling the line regarding the election. Many have a moral compass. Are you painting Christians with a broad brush? Project 2025. Well, I'm not talking about I identify as a Christian or a Christian anarchist. I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. I grew up in the church. Both my father was a minister, my mother was a professor, was a seminary graduate, but I come out of that kind of social gospel, left wing, the Barragans and the Catholic worker kind of movement within the Christian church, which is largely withered away, of course. So no, when I speak about quote unquote Christian fascists or Christian nationalists, I'm talking about heretics, people who have sanctified the worst aspects of white supremacy, American imperialism, and American capitalism, who sanctify the military adventurism of the U.S. For me, they have perverted the gospel in the same way the German Christian Church perverted the gospel to support the Nazi Party in Germany after Hitler took power in 1933. They're similar kinds of figures, and those are the people that I have attempted to call out and really fault the liberal church for not calling these people out, because their response, because they were frightened of them, was to engage in dialogue and tolerance. It's a word Martin Luther King never used, and they did us a huge disservice. So when you even say the word Christian now in the United States, it's the image of these these Christian fascists, these Christian nationalists, and the connecting tissue. If you look at the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, was this Christian nationalism. That was the glue that held these figures together. So this is Eduardo Colea. Should we expect some real changes in the economy if Kamala wins? I mean, no. And then why does superdelegates seem to play a bigger role in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party? And is there a connection to what happened with McGovern and Carter? It seems to me, maybe surprisingly, that the Democratic Party is more heavily controlled by the elites by way of superdelegates compared to the GOP. Well, yes, because the superdelegates, which are appointed and are party officials and governors, etc. The reform is that they can only vote now on the second ballot. But again, we have to acknowledge that Trump's base is real. The fervor for Trump is real. He has built a real movement. It's a dangerous movement. It's a fascistic movement, but it's real in a way that the base for the Democratic Party is a fiction. And so the Democratic Party has to maintain control from the top down. Because, and the example is Sanders. If the Democratic Party hierarchy did not pull all sorts of dirty tricks, stealing the Nevada caucus, blocking independents from voting in the primaries, etc., Bernie would have been the nominee, especially if you would erase the corporate money. Bernie would have been the nominee, and that was an anathema to the people who ran the party. This is Mark. Does a people who consider political apathy and ignorance to be virtues deserve a democracy? I mean, apathy and indifference is exactly what the system seeks to inculcate among the population to demobilize it. And this is a point Sheldon Wolin makes, that mass movements, fascist movements, totalitarian movements seek to mobilize a population. You see it in Trump rallies or the caravans. I once was driving down near the shore in Jersey, and there was a caravan of trucks with American flags and Trump flags. And so that's what, but in what Sheldon calls inverted totalitarianism, a key aspect of it is to demobilize. And so I don't want to blame those people who were demobilized. That is a conscious effort on the part of the corporate state to demobilize. The largest voting bloc, 80 million registered voters don't vote. And that's exactly what the corporate state wants. They fight over that narrow slice of the undecided voters. That's what Harris and Trump are now fighting to get. So yeah, nobody deserves what we've got, unfortunately. Goose, Flora, Fauna, do you see the world today as more Orwellian or Huxleyan? Both. First, we got Huxley amusing ourselves to death, as Postman said. But then after we got fleeced, we get Orwell, the security and surveillance state, the evisceration of civil liberties, the militarization of police, the carceral state. So we've gotten both. We got Huxley first, and now we're getting Orwell. Do you think Bernie Sanders has a chance of being selected as VP? No. Can we defeat corporate America from controlling the government? Is it at all possible? What are your thoughts and recommendations? Strikes. National strikes are the most effective weapon at bringing down any government. And if you read closely, every revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the overthrow of the Shah, on and on and on. Crane Brinton writes about this in his book. It's the strike. And that's why the ruling classes work so hard to break labor unions. Only 11% of the American workforce is unionized, and about 6% of that is the public sector, and they're not allowed to strike, like the railroad freight workers were blocked from striking. So they've worked very, very hard to take from us the weapon that we have, and we have to rebuild a militant labor movement. Shama Sawant's working on this because that's where our power comes from. We have the capacity to shut down and absolutely cripple the economy and hold the ruling class hostage, but it comes from strikes. And that's why mobilization and building militant movements that will carry out strikes is the most important political activity that we can engage in, rather than going and voting for somebody. Edward, how will America react in a truly multipolar world? Would America ever allow the dollar to be taken in a significant way? Well, Edward, that is the point, and I've said it before, and others have said it, Alfred McCoy. Once the dollar is removed as the world's reserve currency, it's over because we fund our empire through debt. Our treasury bonds will be worthless. The value of the dollar will sink. And they're working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. You have efforts by China, Russia, Iran, and other countries to extract themselves from the dollar. We know what it's going to look like because when the pound sterling was dropped as the world's reserve currency, the UK its economy went into a kind of death spiral, or certainly a depression. And that is the blow. Alfred McCoy has written about this. That is the blow that the empire will not recover from. That when it's coming, I think McCoy even says it's 2025 or something. I'm not an economist. I wouldn't be so bold as to ever guess when it's going to happen, but we're moving in that world. And at that point, the hegemony of American power will really be crushed. Joe Gorski, what is your opinion of Thomas Massey for refusing money from Israel? Well, I don't think you should ever take money from an apartheid state. Alan, can we defeat corporate America from controlling the government. From, as I said before, through carrying out strikes, building militant movements that cripple the and shut down the corporate state. Do you think the Uncommitted movement is doing the right thing, courting Harris in exchange for promise of an arms embargo? Sure. I mean, if she would block arms to Israel, that would be significant for me and for many others. I don't see that happening. I voted Uncommitted in the primary as a way to register my disapproval of Biden's embrace for genocide. But that would be a huge, huge step. I don't think that is remotely possible. Jeffrey, what are your thoughts on the election of Maduro in Venezuela? Reports are beginning of a potential coup. And of course, the Venezuelan right wing is alleged electoral fraud. Yeah, the CIA would love a coup. And that's what they're in the business of, along with targeted assassinations and renditions and everything else. And I think I raised that issue before, that the very overt efforts to replace Maduro failed. But we can be sure that our tax dollars are being used in secret to essentially achieve that end. Whether they achieve it or not, I don't know. The CIA's success rate is often not high. So I don't know. We'll see. But I mean, for instance, they've been trying to remove Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua for a long time and it hasn't worked. But yeah, that they're working behind the scenes to do it, I have little doubt. Lois Wilkin, if you're retired, how do you support strikes? Join them on the picket line? What do you think of boycotts? Yeah, join them when Rutgers adjunct faculty went on strike, and I teach as an adjunct in the prisons. I joined them on the picket line. Just because you're retired, I mean, there's, so I live in Princeton, and what was really moving was the way the Muslim community organized to support the Princeton students who in the encampment to protest the genocide in Gaza, providing food every day, providing logistics. I mean, bringing tarps, all that kind of stuff. So anytime that there is an effort by the part of workers to strike, they need people, whether you're retired or not, to come and support that labor stoppage. So yeah, there's a very important role, I think, and I saw it again in the encampment on the part of mostly women in the Princeton area, Muslim women in the Princeton area. So yeah, no, there's definitely an important role. Flower Maze, do you think the situation with Kamala could be called a coup? No, I don't think it's a coup. I think it's just because I don't think anybody really wanted Biden. Biden was selected. She was selected. That's kind of how the system works now, under the facade of the Democratic primary or the Democratic Party voters actually having a say. That's been a fiction for a really long time. So no, I don't think I'd call it a coup. I would just call it a dysfunctional democratic system, or a dysfunctional system that's no longer democratic. And this, I think, is our last one. Maximum Robocop, is the current Free Palestine movement a mass radicalization movement? Yes. I think what's interesting about we're talking mostly about the university students, is that the protests over the genocide in Gaza encompassed all sorts of issues beyond the genocide in Gaza. It encompassed our own kind of neo-colonialism in places like Ukraine or the Middle East, that there was a realization that the suffering inflicted on the Palestinians was one that was intimately familiar to most populations in the global South. It was hardly an anomaly. Also, that the rules-based order was completely disintegrating, and with mass migrations and the disruptions by the climate crisis, what's happening to the Palestinians could very well, the kind of industrial violence that's used against the Palestinians could be used as a tool against those people in the global South. And at least from the only two encampments I was in was at Columbia University and Princeton University, but I think those students were acutely aware of the broader implications of that genocide. Okay, one last question. Why was J.D. Vance, a former Never Trumper, selected as Trump's running mate? Does it have to do with Peter Thiel and Planeteer? Well, yeah, because J.D. Vance wouldn't be in the Senate but for their money. And I don't know, I'm not on the inside, but having read the reports, there was a heavy lobbying effort on their part to essentially make sure Vance was the vice presidential pick. So he strikes me from the outside as just, along with Trump, kind of sleaze incarnate, somebody whose personal ambition trumps any kind of, maybe I shouldn't use that word, his personal ambition is far more important than any political or moral consideration. That's kind of true for all politicians, but in his case and Trump's case, I mean, it's so public and so flagrant. So I mean, these are, if you read William Faulkner, these are the Snopes who rise up out of the decayed aristocratic South to take power. That's who these people are. And go read, I think the first book is The Mansion by Faulkner, if you want to know who Vance is or who Trump is. Well, thank you. And Wednesday, we will relaunch our show that was shut down by the Real News. And we will once again do weekly shows, mostly with writers. I focus on writers, and a heavy focus, of course, on the genocide, because I don't want people to turn away, and I want Israel to be held accountable. Thank you very much.